So I think the task of philosophy and life, for that matter, is the appropriating of one's past in a way that can be creative for a meaningful future.
Hello and welcome to Read, Learn, Live, the podcast about improving yourself through literature. I'm your acclaimed host, John Monaster, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 8, where I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with author John Kaag. John Kaag is professor of philosophy at the University of Massachusetts Lowell and is the author of American Philosophy, a Love Story, published in October by Farrar, Straus and Giroux, which was recently named a New York Times Editor's Choice and one of the best books of 2016 by National Public Radio. His writing has been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Harper's, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. I hope you enjoy our interview as much as I did. All right, everyone, thanks for joining me. My name is John Monaster. I'm here with John Kaag, and this is the Read, Learn, Live podcast. John, say hello.
Hi, thanks for having me, John.
Thanks for joining me. Very excited to be here in Boston. I'm up here in Boston interviewing John about his amazing book, American Philosophy, a Love Story, here in my right hand. Excellent, excellent book. So, John, here's the fun question that you've never heard before. Why don't you just summarize the book for us real quick?
Sure, no problem. So, I guess I'll start by saying just a little bit about what motivated the book, and you'll get a sense of the book's arc in a second. But in 1895, William James, who was regarded as the father of American philosophy, walked across Harvard Yard to give a lecture. And the lecture was entitled, "Is Life Worth Living?" And usually people think of this as like a mutually exclusive, and the answer is mutually exclusive, yes or no. But James said, maybe life is worth living. It depends, according to James, on the liver. And I really thought that this was a complete cop-out for most of my life. I thought the answer was automatically yes, all the time, every day of the week, including Sundays. And I didn't really get James's maybe until 2009, when I was at Harvard investigating the philosophy of William James and looking for the origins of American philosophy on a postdoc. And in 2009, my father, who we had always been distant, he died, and I had the experience of watching him die. And then during that time, I was going through a bit of a crisis, not a bit, a serious crisis. And the marriage that was sort of floundering really took a downturn, and I went through a divorce, or began to go through a divorce. So James's maybe made a lot more sense then. And I didn't find what I was looking for at Harvard, the origins of American philosophy, but I found it the next fall, or began to find it the next fall, when I came across, very unexpectedly, a library up in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, which provided an escape for me from my Boston life and the crumbling marriage that I was leaving. And the story, American Philosophy, a Love Story, is really the story of a lost person, a lost library, and a lost philosophical tradition, and the sort of simultaneous recovery of all three.
Wow. That's very intense, and I think very meaningful. So I appreciate that introduction. So I guess you kind of went to this library. You were going through a lot in your life. Why did you decide to write this book, write this in this way? You know, this book is kind of a blend of American philosophy as well as other philosophy, as well as your own personal story, kind of a blend between a memoir and a philosophical exploration. So why did you decide to write it like this?
Sure. So American philosophy is unique, I think, in the sense that it requires philosophy to be deeply personal. So in Walden, Henry David Thoreau says that most philosophy has erred by avoiding the word I. And Thoreau says he will not make this error. The I will always be present. And I think that I took that pretty seriously And it was also an inescapable part of finding a library that was full of philosophy. So this library that I discovered was owned by William Ernest Hocking, William James's last student at Harvard, one of James's last students at Harvard. And I came across this library because it's sort of, I look back on it and I think, how the hell did this happen? But I came across this library in the fall of 2009. I was helping organize a conference up in Socorro in New Hampshire, which was William James's summer town, or he had his summer home there. And I bumped into a 91-year-old guy by the name of Bun Nickerson up in Socorro. And Bun asked me what I did. I said sort of sheepishly that I was a philosopher. And he said, "Oh, I knew a philosopher. I used to live on a philosopher's land." And I said, "Well, Bun, could you please tell me what philosopher that was?" He goes, "Yeah, it was William Ernest Hocking." And my jaw sort of just dropped because Hocking had been James's student. And I said, "Bun, could you take me up to this library that you talk about that's on this estate?" And he said, "There's a library up there." And he did. He put me in his Dodge pickup truck, and we bounced up the hill to this place called Westwind. And Westwind was William Ernest Hocking's estate. And he had built a freestanding, non-winterized library that housed about 15,000 books. And in the process of exploring that library, and I guess we can talk about the contents of the library a little bit later, but in the process of exploring that library over 2 years, I came to realize that American philosophy was, by its very nature, deeply personal, and that it could affect a life very immediately. In fact, it could save a life. And that's sort of what I discovered. I mean, one of the things I discovered there. I'm sure we'll get into it a bit more.
So this was probably, I'm going to guess, a difficult book to write. I mean, what was your writing process? How did you sit down and actually make this book happen?
Sure. I guess I have to say a little bit more about the book, and then eventually we'll get to the point where I started writing the book, because I wrote the book after the fact. The entire experience of discovering the library, discovering its contents, visiting the library repeatedly, and then eventually bringing my colleague, Dr. Carol Hay, up with me to investigate the library. This was all just an experience that I was having, and only after the fact did I sort of think, oh, this is actually a book.
Huh.
So what happened the first day that I arrived at Westwind was the door to the library. Nobody was around. The Hockings no longer lived there all year round. They only lived there during the summer. It was fall. And the door to the library was open, or at least unlocked. And I let myself in that first day when Bun took me up. And inside the library, what happened when William James died and when Josiah Royce, the idealist at Harvard, died, is that their books had to go somewhere. And a lot of those books, William James's books, the father of American philosophy, a lot of his books ended up with Hocking up in the library up in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. And so you had this sort of time capsule of American philosophy. In addition to that, you also had first editions from the 17th and 18th century. So first edition Hobbes, first edition Descartes, first edition Locke, John Locke. All of these just hanging out on largely abandoned shelves up in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. And so I went in and I was just sort of taken aback, just flabbergasted by this. And over the course of 2 years, I enlisted some help. And the help that I enlisted was Carol, who was once my colleague and then became my friend and is now my wife or partner. And the story, why it's called American Philosophy, a love story, is it's a story. It's a love affair with philosophy, but it's also simply a love story in a very conventional sense. It's the story of a person going through a relationship that is crumbling, and then trying to rethink what philosophy can teach you about reforming a relationship on the basis of freedom and love. And that's what sort of I discovered at the library. Now, your question: how did you come to the book? has a better answer now. So Carol said to me after we had gone through the library, she said, "Hey, there might be an actual, you should write a little article about this discovery of the library." And that little article just, bloomed into personal reflections at first, but then, a 270-page book.
I mean, that's interesting to hear you use that language, because my next question was going to be, what is the hardest part? But when you say something like bloomed, it almost makes it sound like it was just coming out of you. Like once you got started, you really were into it.
Yeah. And I mean, what's interesting about it is first drafts come very quickly, I think. So the first draft of American Philosophy, a Love Story, was written in a little less than 2 months. And I thought that at the time, oh, this is great. I should just send this off to my editor.
Yeah.
And that's what I did. And she sent it back to me and said it has to be completely rewritten. The editing process took 1.5 years.
Wow.
So the first draft came very quickly. You're right. It just sort of flowed out. But God, Eileen Smith, my editor at FSG, sort of really walked me through and was incredibly patient with me as I sort of revised this book.
Well, that's great. That's the key, right? Or maybe the key difficulty a lot of people have is going from that draft to something that's a polished book that everyone can enjoy. Because I think maybe the story in your head is often a little bit different than the story people need to, or the way other people perceive the story.
Right. That's right.
So that's good. I kind of want to jump here. I had a question because I really found this book to be fascinating because I felt like a fly on the wall. It felt as if I was there in so many different occasions when you were at the library or elsewhere. And you mentioned that you didn't really come up with the idea till late in the process, and you kind of wrote this after the fact. How are you able to retain the details throughout that you use to really add a lot of, color and flavor to the novel?
Nice. No, that's a great question. So 2 things. One, I was writing while I was there, but sort of informally. So
Okay.
I would keep a journal, or I would make notes about what I was finding, and even make notes about what I was seeing. So I mean, West Wind is one of those, I think, sort of magical places that you come across that reminds you that even things that pass away leave traces, remains behind. And one of the things that I was doing while I was there is reflecting on that. So, for example, when things are completely destroyed, when your estranged alcoholic father dies, or when you go through a divorce, or when some tragedy hits, what remains? And I think that Westwind was the type of place that gives one hope that even if things are sort of on the verge of complete destruction, like a library, like an old forgotten library up in New Hampshire, that something remains, and trying to figure out how that's meaningful. The remains are meaningful. So I was writing about that, but I never thought that it would reach the level of an article or a book.
So you had a personal journal that you were kind of using. Oh, yeah. That's interesting. Do you feel like that in general helps you to remember writing stuff down? Is that why you were doing it in the first place?
I do, but I also think that a lot of authors, I know this is the case for a lot of authors, is we work ourselves out over the page. So for example, many novelists, most people who are writing memoir, like it's a process of figuring yourself out on the page, and that's kind of what I think about writing now, or that's how I think about writing now. And this book is very clearly that. In other words, when you read it, you get a sense, I hope, of a person working through existential issues, but also get a sense of somebody engaging in philosophical thinking in a sort of as honest a way as one could. Or that's not true. I mean, I mean, self-knowledge, I think, is partial, at best partial. But that's why we write, I think, is to sort of figure this out
Yeah.
over the course of, many days of writing
Yeah.
or a lifetime of writing.
Right. It's a good habit. It's a good practice. So we kind of already alluded to this, but the book is a really interesting combination of love story and kind of guide to American philosophy. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the interplay between the philosophers you chose to highlight and their philosophies that you spoke about and how that related to your story.
Sure, absolutely. So the history of Western philosophy is the history, according to James, of a sort of debate or battle of temperaments. And I had always been of a certain type of temperament that fit with certain types of philosophers. So, for example, in modern philosophy being starting around 1600 and running through the late 1700s, these philosophers, so Descartes, Hobbes, Kant, for example, Immanuel Kant, they all have a conception of a person that fit with my early notion of what a person is. And I'll just sort of briefly flesh it out. So Thomas Hobbes, who wrote the Leviathan and whose first edition of Leviathan was sitting in Hawking's library, written in the 1650s, Hobbes's Leviathan tells a story about human beings where everybody is out for their own, individual, rational, self-interested. Okay, and everybody is in a battle to the death. Okay, is deeply competitive. So life is nasty, brutish, and short, according to Hobbes. And this had always sort of resonated with me as a philosopher, that life is, you just pursue your own, it's nasty, brutish, and short. And any type of relationship we get into is a type of contractual one. It's not, at the end of the day, relationships are conveniences or are exchanges between two self-interested parties. It's very little surprise that this does not deliver one to a good relationship. And so I reached the point of divorce, coming to the realization that modern philosophy really didn't, think that even though I had studied American philosophy that started in the 1820s and 1830s, I really hadn't taken their lessons to heart. Mm-hmm. Because American philosophy, it teaches us something different about human beings and the relationships they have with one another. It teaches two things. One, that human beings are radically free, and that human beings can exercise their freedom in interpersonal relationships that are deeply meaningful apart from self-interest. So I think about Emerson's, and I mentioned this in the book, Emerson's essays, his most famous essay is probably Self-Reliance, which says that you can exercise your freedom and that you should exercise your freedom and not allow others to constrain your freedom. But we oftentimes forget that Emerson intended this sort of Promethean individualism to be tempered by another essay, which he calls Compensation. These are sister essays. And Compensation says, no matter how free you are, you always enact your freedom in the context of others. That being with others is constitutive of a person. In other words, being with others creates us or makes us who we are. And that's something that I only learned at the library through the process of both rereading American philosophy, but then also the process of falling in love with Carol.
One of the things you touch on several times throughout the book is how mainstream philosophy now tends to retreat into the ivory tower. It deals less with things that affect the day-to-day lives of people. And I'm just curious why you think this happened. What's going on here?
Well, in the early part of the 20th century, William James writes an essay called The PhD Octopus. And in this essay, in this little lecture that James gives, he says that our obsession with credentials is going to narrow the focus of the love of wisdom. So, every single PhD that anyone ever gets, whether it's a PhD in chemistry or biology or it's PhD for a reason. It's PH philosophy, Doctor of Philosophy. And James, being the polymath that he was, in other words, being able to be an artist and a philosopher, and he was the father of empirical psychology, and he was a physiologist at Harvard. He taught anatomy for a long time at Harvard. He could do all of these different things, and he saw that the discipline of philosophy was being narrowed down or thinned down by virtue of our disciplinary constraints and the requirements that we would put on professors to profess rather than to engage with the world. And James was really worried about that, in fact. So I think that's one reason why we see philosophy in the 20th century moving away from existential questions like, is life worth living?
Yeah, I wonder if that happens in other subject areas as well. Then it sort of speaks to maybe specialization, which is something I think is happening everywhere. I mean, it's something that if you go back, you think about someone like Leonardo da Vinci, who touched on lots of different areas, or even someone like Ben Franklin, who touched on lots of different areas throughout his life. Whereas now, because we are such experts in so many different things, maybe you really need to focus in on one particular thing, and that takes away from maybe the more general areas that just individual citizens, people might be interested in.
Right.
I mean, is there a way to counter that? How do we solve that problem?
No, that's a great question. So it's interesting. At the Hawking Library, one of Hawking's closest friends was a mathematician and philosopher by the name of Alfred North Whitehead. And in the midst of World War I, Whitehead's son Eric dies, and Whitehead almost immediately, gives a lecture called "The Aims of Education," which you wouldn't see the relationship between the dying of a son and a lecture called "The Aims of Education" easily. But Whitehead in this lecture says education is to be geared to two things: expert knowledge, which is the very specific, disciplinary specific knowledge that we need, but then also to what he calls culture. And culture is, for Whitehead, two things. It's activity of thought and the receptivity to humane feeling. And so Whitehead believes that whatever specific or very narrow knowledge, whatever very narrow facts that we acquire in education, we need to learn how to apply them to a broad range of experiences and allow a broad range of feelings to impact how we use those specific facts. So it's a type of balance between the humanistic sort of holism, educational holism, or a broad notion of education, and what Whitehead sees as the sort of specialization of knowledge.
So it's learn your specialization, but don't forget, your roots. Don't forget the broad parts of it all, and try and maybe go back and apply that.
Right.
Oh, that's interesting. And so that leads into my next question, which is, you talk about the task of classical American philosophy, and you write that it was to declare its intellectual independence while remaining firmly rooted in the distant past. So why do you think that is? And do you think that's something we should be doing for ourselves? Understanding and remaining connected to our past, but also being our own independent selves and looking towards our own independent futures.
Right. Well, yeah, I think personally that's a good motto to hold to. Yeah, I mean, I think that whenever we think we can divorce ourselves from our past, we run into serious problems. And whenever we think that we're completely rooted in our past, we run into real problems. So American philosophy is often poo-pooed as not having a history. So as not having a basis in any long-term intellectual tradition. And that's just wrong. And that was something that I discovered most pointedly at the Hawking Library. So usually the story goes that American philosophers are so hell-bent on being original that their philosophy really is just a mirror image of American exceptionalism. It's that this is a special type of philosophy. It's American philosophy. But in fact, if we read the American philosophers carefully, if we read Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, William James, Jane Addams, Josiah Royce, John Dewey, all of these thinkers are deeply, deeply invested in debating and sort of interacting with the history of philosophy in particular ways. So I think the task of philosophy, and life for that matter, is the appropriating of one's past in a way that can be creative for a meaningful future. And I think that that's sort of the task of life. I mean, we're not given choices about where we're born or who our father is or who our mother is, but we have the task in life of sort of carrying that past along in such a way that it can create a meaningful future. And I think that that's what American philosophy is up to.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that, that balance is key. Montaigne wrote, and you highlighted in the book, marriage is like a cage. One sees the birds outside desperate to get in, and those inside equally desperate to get out. And I like to call this the grass is always greener problem. But maybe talk about that for a second, why that was so poignant for you.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that resonated with me very clearly as I was exiting my first marriage. And I got married very young, and I was only 30. I was 30 years old when I discovered West Wind and started to go through a divorce. And I think that Montaigne's comments, for many people, Montaigne's comment for many people applies. We think that things are going to be sorted out when we get married just by virtue of being married, and we really want to get married. But then when we get into the marriage, we discover, like Emerson says, my giant goes with me wherever I go. It's not like something radically changes when you like put the ring on or walk down the aisle if you do that sort of thing. But rather, it's the case that you sometimes you just want to get out. As soon as you get in, you're like, well, this wasn't what it was cracked up to be. And the problem is that you sort of misunderstand what I think long-term relationships are about. And that's the process of realizing that love is not, Thomas Merton says, love is not a package. It's not something to be exchanged. It's not this mutually beneficial exchange, a la Hobbes, which I think still applies in our culture. It's something different. It's an enlivening. Merton says it's an enlivening of life. Love is an enlivening of life that sometimes wanes, sometimes waxes, and you have to be sort of patient with the waning and waxing.
So speaking of love, you wrote that, after you discovered West End, in the following months, you started cheating on your wife with a room full of books. So why was Hawkins Library so important to you?
Well, it was a sort of safe space. I mean, it was a place where I could get away, and it was a place where I could sort out what I really believed in. And Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher, asks, like, what do you love? Like, at the end of the day, one of the most important questions in life is what do you love? What do you adore? And sometimes you can't answer that question when you're surrounded by others. Sometimes you just need to sort it out in a moldy, non-winterized library on 400 acres in the middle of New Hampshire. So you just need to get away. So that's one reason. The other reason is, I don't know how to explain this exactly, but I never felt like I was completely alone. I never felt like I was completely alone at Westwind. Even before Carol came to Westwind with me, I felt like this place was actually, I won't say haunted, but let's just say I never felt alone. I felt more with people at Westwind than I did in my everyday life in Boston, which is pretty weird considering that it's a city.
Yeah, but it was that you found the connection,
right?
You found that, which is important. Once you found the library, you dedicated yourself to preserving the books, and this was a big part of the book was you going through the library and sorting it all out and trying to figure out what was going to happen with all these incredibly rare and important books. Why do you think that was so important? So you could have just found the library and just kept it as your own little library and shown up and read books and hung out and whatever, but you made a decision that you were going to preserve it somehow, get the books elsewhere, do something with them. So why did you make that decision, and why was the preservation process meaningful?
Sure. I mean, I think the part of philosophy that really struck me when I found Westwind is philosophy at its best, and I say this in the book, philosophy at its best is supposed to help us see why our lives that are seemingly so fragile and ephemeral might actually mean something. And it's to preserve what is both noble and worth preserve. It's to preserve and figure out what's worthy of preservation about us as human beings. So notions of virtue or notions of duty, notions of reality, truth, and goodness. Like these are, this is the bread and butter of the history of Western philosophy. So to your question about why to save these very old books, and they were old books, right? And they weren't in great condition. They were on the verge of, complete disintegration in this library. And there was the sense that you should not allow a first edition John Locke's Two Treatises on Government, 1691, to be torn apart or to be completely lost. It was like books used to be fragile little bodies and regarded as fragile little bodies. The corpus, right? The corpus. And I came to appreciate that there's a sort of objectness to books that's sort of sacred, especially very old books. It proves that things can sort of remain, or that things can, stick around. And I was really intent on seeing at least a few of these books stick around for the next generation. Now, one of the sad things about that process of preservation is that they had to be moved off site. So it's, William Ernest Hocking, his son Richard Hocking, the Hocking granddaughters, or William Ernest Hocking's granddaughters, they all thought that it was very important to keep this time capsule intact. The problem with keeping a time capsule intact in the 21st century, however, is many people don't think that it's important to keep time capsules intact. And Hocking had tried to place his books with Harvard, had tried to place his books with multiple institutions without any success.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me that you brought up how people aren't so interested in keeping time capsules together anymore. You don't talk about this much in the book, but I was curious about what your thoughts are about how preservation itself is changing as we kind of move into the digital age, and it becomes much more trivial to keep things, but also much more trivial to throw them away. We can, with a click of a mouse, make decisions about whether we're going to delete an entire paper we wrote without submitting it, or we're going to save it online in the cloud forever. How do you feel about all that? What is there a future person? Are they going to stumble into a digital library and make these decisions? What's going to happen?
I mean, what I think's interesting, one of the things that I found interesting about writing this book is just thinking about, will this type of book be possible in 150 years? And I think the answer is probably maybe not. And I think that that's a real loss. And it's also a real loss with how we read. I mean, if we think about the rise of electronic books and audiobooks, I mean, books used to be something that you lived with. And I mean physically lived with. Like the entire Hocking library is just windows and books. There are no walls. It's all books. It's all bookshelves. So the entire room is a bookshelf and windows. And it's occupying the same space with books and artifacts, I think, that actually will be lost in the 21st century and beyond. And I think that that's a real shame. I I'm sure that we get things with technology, but I think we also risk losing things.
Right. Winners and losers. So you talk a bit about Viktor Frankl and the existential vacuum and how that relates to Thoreau's contention that we need very little in life. So I thought that was an interesting juxtaposition. Can you maybe talk about that for a bit and then expand a little bit?
Sure. So Viktor Frankl says a number of things in Man's Search for Meaning. It's a wonderful book. Frankl is an existentialist, but he's writing while he's in a concentration camp during World War II. And Frankl says, man can, everything can be taken from a man except one thing, his ability to respond to a really bad situation. In other words, even in really bad situations, human beings still have some freedom. And I think that that is actually an underlying message in many American philosophers. So, for example, we see in Emerson when his son died, and when his wife died, his first wife died, Emerson sort of holding the idea that some sort of possibility is able to be negotiated even in this tragic loss. With Thoreau, I think the same issue is at hand. So too with William James with the question, is life worth living? Like none of these philosophers are strangers to crisis nor to real loss. And so I think Frankl's pushing on something, and he's saying we are radically free even in the worst of times, which means that we are both free to respond but also responsible, radically responsible, to respond in a way that we can live with.
James thought that we are free for such a short time, and he wrote that there are often better things to do than philosophy. And I thought that was interesting. You know, obviously he was all over the place and into lots of things, and we've, spoken a little bit about the ivory tower and all that. And I thought that was a very interesting comment because, there's an endless choice that we have now. We were talking about the digital age. There's an endless choice of things to do all the time. And I guess I was curious to hear you talk a little bit about, focus and what we pay attention to and what we spend our time doing. And if you had any thoughts on, whether we can get focused on good things or bad things, or whether just by deciding they become good or bad. That
Right.
makes sense.
It does, yeah. So this comes out in both moments of American pragmatism in James, but then also in European existentialism, which is when you are radically free, you are radically, like I just said, you are radically responsible for your actions. And now the question is, how do you exercise your freedom? How do you pick? I mean, there are so many options open. How do you pick? And I think that for James, there were some right answers. Okay, the existentialists won't follow James all the way here, but there are some ways of thinking for James. James says, in A Certain Blindness in Human Beings, an essay that he gives near the end of his life, he says, one of the tasks of philosophy, but also of life, is to imagine things otherwise, to put ourselves in other people's shoes, to expand our own sort of self beyond the hermetically sealed bubble that I oftentimes think is just quote unquote my life. And I think that he's right about that. I don't think he's not going to give you any particular instructions about the duties of doing so, but he gestures to the possibilities that might accompany this type of relationship or this type of extension into the lives of others. So that's one thing.
This was a really personal book, and you said some really interesting things about yourself, and I think especially things that we often don't take the time to consider. And so an example of that is when you wrote that you never had malevolent intentions when it comes to others. But you sort of say, well, it was just that you didn't really care too much about them. You just didn't really spend the time to care. And you also wrote that sometimes you thought of people as things to be avoided or managed, as opposed to people like yourself with inner lives. And that really resonated with me because I think that happens to everybody, including myself, where it becomes really easy to just kind of keep walking past that person or ignore the person that is trying to get your attention in one way or another in life. I would be curious to know what you think about empathy and how important empathy is in our modern world, and how you overcame some of those things that you raised.
Sure. So I mean, with Hobbes, I think the theme is he says that human beings are non-tuistic. Non-tuistic means non-other regarding. It's not that they hate each other; they just don't regard each other, and they certainly regard their own interests as far more important than someone else's, right? So I think that American philosophers sort of challenge that from Emerson straight through John Dewey in the 1960s. So 130 years of challenging that position. And I think when it comes to empathy, the American philosophers, there's this seeming tension between the two themes that I bring out in American philosophy: freedom on the one hand and love on the other. Okay, these seem at first glance like they're mutually exclusive. So for example, how can you be free if you're tied to someone else, right? And the trick for American philosophers is always to figure out how to maintain individuality or individual freedom while at the same time being deeply interconnected with others. That's like the tension that sort of drives much of American philosophy, from Emerson's compensation and self-reliance. Now, a couple things show up here in terms of your question about empathy. So, if you think about Henry David Thoreau, he's a loner, okay? His best friends are the children who would follow him through the Concord woods while he picked huckleberries. Adults thought that he was a bit of a crank and a bit of a misanthrope. So you could say, Kaag, what do you mean? Like, how could you say that American philosophy is about empathy and togetherness when Thoreau is such a loner? Like Emerson sometimes seems like such a loner. James sometimes seems like such a loner. And the answer is that sometimes you need a bit of distance to maintain your individual thoughts or your individual actions. That's one way of thinking. So there's this shuttling between isolation, or let's just call it solitude, not isolation, but solitude and togetherness. Mm-hmm. There's this constant shuttling that American philosophy suggests. Additionally, Thoreau, I think, is especially good on saying that love and compassion isn't always the easiest thing. In fact, when you love someone else, you're bringing your freedom into sort of such close proximity with someone else that there's going to arise tension. Okay, he says, Diogenes, the ancient cynic, says, like, I only bite my friends, right? I only bite and I think Thoreau is exactly the same way. He was very biting at times, but you learn to bite your friends, and it's a type of relationship that is based on honesty, trust, and risk. And these three things, I think, are what American philosophy sort of, encourages at certain points.
It's kind of like your friends are the ones that can take it.
True, and to be a friend is to be willing to go to battle with somebody, and fight it out,
and not just walk away.
And that's really and not just walk away, I think, and that's a lesson that I learned in the process of going through West Wind. Like, you fight it out. You do not just walk away.
So you wrote that being punished for telling a lie makes sense, but being sacrificed on the altar of truth seemed cruel. So I liked that line. Can you maybe expand on that and give an example or two?
Yeah, sure. I mean, when you're going through a relationship and you come to a point where you think, geez, this relationship's really not working out, right? There are ways to dissemble, to sort of to get around the question of whether the relationship is going well or not. You can sort of tell these white lies or convenient truths, or you can be really brutal about it. Okay, and you can just say this is not working out for X, Y, and Z reason. And there are ways, especially in family life or in the life of friends, where telling the truth is in fact is punishable.
Hmm.
And I think that those are, at the time I was going through trying to figure out how to tell my now ex-wife that this is over, and tell her family that we were all that we were incredibly close, but trying to be honest with them about what was happening. And that was not easy. That was not an easy process. And in part I realized that I'm going back to Friedrich Nietzsche because I'm writing a book now about Nietzsche, but he says we have to be willing to ask the forbidden questions, and we have to be willing to sort of address very uncomfortable truths. And I think that's the case. And so I guess that's the quote that you were wondering about.
We spoke a bit about personal responsibility, and there's a really interesting discussion in the book, I thought, about chance. And you talk about chance as it relates to Pierce and Pierce's design and chance. So what did Pierce mean when he said chance was an opening for human beings to explore at their will, and a space to be sort of personally responsible for their actions?
There are two meanings of chance that Peirce plays with. There is chance as the sort of random occurrence, the metaphysical condition of random occurrences, things that sort of show up, like non-winterized libraries in the middle of a life that's going to hell. Like, that's a chance. I mean, it's just happened. And I oftentimes think, like, what would life be like had I not met Bun Nickerson? Like, would Carol and I have gotten together? Would like, what would have happened? So that's one way that you can think about chance, is just random occurrence. But American philosophers, and especially a woman by the name of Ella Lyman Cabot, who I had read and wrote about before going to Westwind. Ella Lyman Cabot, anyway, she said, chance is always my chance. So in other words, these random occurrences that happen in life create a sort of space in order for us to exercise our freedom, okay, or to exercise ourselves, to insert ourselves into something that might not have been otherwise. So for example, I could have not gotten into Bun Nickerson's car, or I could not have tested the door of the library, but these are all choices that you make, or at least actions that you take, right? And so Peirce was interested in the relationship between this metaphysical idea of random occurrences and the way that it creates a sort of opening for us to live free and meaningful lives. Because if you think about your life, I bet that most of the most meaningful things of your life happened at a sort of random occurrence, or oftentimes happens at a random occurrence, at a juncture that you pick.
No, that's a great point. I mean, that's probably true for everyone across all moments. I mean, just things like, and I often go back to this sort of thing too. It's like, what if I had picked a different college to go to? Like that. Everything else would have changed. All, my friends, my career, just where I lived, and it just every little decisions here or there have radical implications down the line. You were taught to ignore the personalities that gave rise to philosophical arguments, but you wrote that this was sort of impossible for American philosophy. So I was curious why you thought that is, and also why we tend to do that so much in the first place, whether for philosophy or anything else. I mean, you can think about the arts, and often it's very difficult for us to separate out, the maybe personal feelings of an artist from the art that they created.
Right. So, I mean, there's this term known as the biographical fallacy, which is the idea that you commit a fallacy every time you try to understand a theory or to understand a piece of art by virtue of the life that produced it. And I just think in some cases that's simply wrong. If for the following, for the reason that, like when you think about Walden, this was sort of where we started the interview, is that in Walden, the I is never omitted. Like the personal is never omitted. And I think that many times philosophy is a response to particular cultural and personal situations, such that the philosophy can't be understood without addressing those cultural and personal situations. And so like when Hegel says that philosophy is is sort of an outgrowth of culture, I don't think that you can understand philosophy without the culture and the culture of the person who's producing it. So I've recently become really interested in Nietzsche, I've always been interested in Nietzsche, but I'm writing more about him now, and Arthur Schopenhauer, two German philosophers, where it's very clear that their philosophy is a response in some ways to their biographical situations. That is definitely the case with James. When he gives the issue, Is Life Worth Living, or rather, when he gives the lecture, Is Life Worth Living, it's a response to the fact that he's been what he calls sick-souled for much of his life. In other words, he's been dealing with depression and anxiety. He doesn't give a straight yes. He gives a maybe. It depends on the liver.
So I wanted to talk about this idea of loving care, and to go back to Peirce real quick. And you wrote about gardening and how gardening was Peirce's favorite example of loving care. Mm-hmm. And he said that because the results can be influenced but not controlled or guaranteed, and there's no sort of predestiny attached. And that gives gardening a very certain purpose. So I really like that idea, and I was wondering if you could talk about that a bit and maybe think about areas where we could find that in our lives.
Yeah.
For those of us in cities without gardens, maybe.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, of course. So, I mean, Peirce was also a complete curmudgeon, okay, for most of his life. He lived a very, very tragic life. He could never hold down a university position, even though he was brilliant. His friends oftentimes, he would he was an expert of self-sabotage. He would sabotage relationships and friendships. But at the end of his life, oddly enough, he begins to write about love. And he begins to write about what he calls evolutionary love. And I'm going to just boil this down very quickly. He's not talking about the romantic love that we have on Valentine's Day or about this exchange. Mm-hmm. He's talking about what he calls agape. Agape is the it's a very old notion, but it's more recently, it's sort of the Christian notion of divine love, which many people's eyes sort of glaze over and they're like, oh, I can't figure out what divine love means. But Peirce actually boils it down pretty nicely for us. He says that agape is the willingness and the ability to love even that which is most antagonistic to us. Hmm. And I think that's a really trenchant idea, especially for today.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think it's a trenchant idea for city dwellers, especially. I mean, when you walk down the street and you pass somebody who doesn't, who's asking you for money, this is not an assault. They're not assaulting you. Can you actually muster the ability to treat them like a human being instead of simply an object? That's what Peirce is up to. And I mean, I think especially in our current political climate, like things are so divisive. And I think Peirce's notion of agape sort of like keys us into the fact that even that which is most antagonistic can be loved. And the love that Peirce is suggesting, and I think you gesture toward this in the gardening example that I used, it's a type of attentive care to someone that allows them to flourish in their own terms or on their own terms. It's not constrictive. It's not overly demanding. It's a type of give and take that allows you to flourish, or allows someone else or some other thing to flourish on their own terms.
And maybe speaking about that, Wallace talks about how we're not fated to be alone, and because we have this rare chance to venture outside to others. And you mentioned this in the book, kind of right after you found out your colleague Carol was also getting a divorce. So you had this rare chance, and we talked about chance for a second, and how what we do with those chances we have can make differences in our lives. So what kind of made you take advantage of this particular rare chance, which I think really is what a lot of the book is boiling down to? It's kind of this moment when you've got the library going on, you've got Carol going on, Carol comes back from this trip, and you find out this momentous thing, and you make a big decision based on this rare chance in your life.
Right. I mean, part of the book, and I say this in the book, part of the book is about unrequited love. So, I mean, I fell in love with Carol well before I think she fell in love with me. And that's quite obvious to me. Quite obvious to her, too. So the part of, in part, it was already, the opening just had to happen, or didn't have to happen. But that's all it took for me to be able to venture into the relationship, or for us to venture into the relationship. Had she not come back from Tuscany, which she was visiting with her family, had she not come back from Italy and said, I too am getting a divorce, I'm absolutely sure we still would be just colleagues.
Yeah.
Or good friends. So I think that's pretty...
So you were just kind of ready.
I was ready.
You were ready. Okay.
I was ready.
So that's interesting, because it means that you had, maybe you'd even thought about something like that beforehand, and you would kind of run through, okay, this is, if I ever get my chance, like, I am in.
Yes,
whatever.
That's absolutely the case.
Yeah.
That is absolutely the case.
Fair enough. And this is another really, really great line I liked. You talked about Jane Addams, and she wrote that the things that frighten us the most are the things that deserve the most attention. Mm-hmm. And wow, I thought that was so important and so meaningful. So maybe talk about something that frightens you now or frightened you in the past, and how you think this idea might have helped.
Good. Let me put a little, let me say just a little bit about Addams, because
Sure.
she's usually, part of this book is about women in philosophy. So, I mean, it's 3 chapters are really about women in philosophy. And Addams is oftentimes a neglected figure who does not deserve to be neglected. So Jane Addams is the founder of Hull House in Chicago, a contemporary of John Dewey's, who is oftentimes regarded as a American philosopher. And Addams is oftentimes just regarded as a social reformer and not as a philosopher. But to my way of thinking, she's a full-fledged philosopher. She's just doing applied philosophy, trying to figure out how to build communities in Chicago. But she's also a writer. I mean, she's prolific in terms of her writing. So Addams starts Hull House after going to London and visiting what's known as Toynbee Hall in London, which was a social reform house in London that served the workers in London in the 19th century, in the late 19th century. And she's basically exposed to a type of poverty in London that initially scares the hell out of her. And so the comment that I made in the book, that those things that frighten us the most are precisely the things that we need to look at, is what she does and has the courage to do in London and then in Chicago. I mean, she said, I was scared, but I overcame that fear, and I faced it. In other words, most of her life was spent dealing with the small atrocities that happen in underprivileged areas, and small and large atrocities. So your question was, what scares me, and how am I dealing with it? So that is a very good question. So most immediately, I'm deeply concerned about the state of politics in the United States. And so, and I am actually scared. And I'm trying my best to figure out ways to confront those things that scare me. So that's a straightforward example. In terms of literature, or in terms of writing, I'm concerned about being a bad parent. I mean, that's a real issue for me. My father didn't give great role models. My mother did, but my father really didn't. He showed very clearly that you could really mess up. And so I'm worried about it. And so what I'm doing is actually writing a book about Nietzsche and parenthood right now, that's sort of written in the same memoir style, that addresses some of those fears, because it's not easy and you can mess up, and I'm scared. And so, like I said, I use writing to sort of work myself over the page, and that's what I'm doing now.
It's really interesting. I like that idea. And now I'm looking forward to the book as well, because I thought you combined the two very well here. So I can't wait. Near the end of the book, you talk about the loss of your father a bit, and you talk about how his absence drove you to philosophy. You know, you were kind of trying to find answers and hoping that those philosophers would explain themselves in the world, and you would get something out of that. So do you feel like that desire was realized, or how did that go?
I think that most of my life I've been looking for sort of like father figures to sort of stand in for an absence. And I think absence is really present, weirdly enough. And so you look to the fathers of philosophy to sort of sort your problems out. And that's what I did for much of my early, career, my time in philosophy. I don't think that's the best way to go about philosophy. But I think that many people do that. Not just looking for fathers, but looking for guidance, period. And so I think, to answer your question, it is definitely the case that the fathers and mothers and founders of American philosophy helped me sort out the death of a father. And it helped me sort out a life. That's true. What I've discovered since then, since writing this book, is that the quest for definitive answers, and I gesture to this at the end of the book, the quest for definitive answers is one that often is not suited for beings like us. In other words, we're not gonna find definitive answers. And so I'm still, I guess, looking. And questioning about the methods of how to look, like how is it best to search for answers? What sort of answers fit? And this, I guess, is what I'm addressing in the next book.
That's interesting. Reminds me, what's that line from The Matrix? She says, Trinity says something to Neo like it's not the answers to the questions that drive us.
Right.
Something like that. I think that's very similar to pulling a random science fiction movie. So we've talked a lot about the past of American philosophy, and we've talked a lot about how it's hanging out in the ivory tower a bit now. What are your thoughts about the future? What do you think is going to happen with American philosophy going forward?
So, I mean, I think that there have been many times, my friend Clancy Martin said this to me. He said, there are many times in the history of philosophy where philosophers have had to stake a great deal on their thinking. And I think we're entering one of those periods right now, where philosophers might be called on to stake a great deal on their thoughts. And I hope that's the case. And I hope that philosophers, professional philosophers and people who are philosophers but who aren't professors, will stand up and do that, sort of thinking people who can stand up and stake something on their thoughts. So I'm hopeful for the future of philosophy. Philosophy oftentimes flourishes in times of political and cultural upheaval, and I'm hoping that we have the people to do that.
I like that. It's a very hopeful message. It's good to hold on to in these times. So that sort of wraps up my main questions. I like to have a little fun thunder round at the end, just to wrap it up. What do you think? You ready?
Sounds good.
We'll do it. Then we'll be done.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. So first off, what is your favorite food and or drink?
My favorite food is any type of pasta, and my favorite drink is still and unfortunately beer.
That is that's okay. I myself drink beer. Totally acceptable. And I think we're lucky to be drinking beer now, right? We have the largest selection of beers ever.
Exactly.
Just think about
infinite possibilities.
Infinite possibilities with beer and with pasta, to be fair. So, and it's funny because I asked this question to everyone, but from the book, I may already know the answer, but you could surprise me. But what's your favorite place you've ever been?
West Wind is right up there.
Yeah,
it's
okay,
right up there.
Okay.
But my second favorite place is where the second book is actually going to be set, which is Sils Maria, Switzerland.
Oh, interesting.
It's going to be called Hiking with Nietzsche.
Ooh, okay. That's exciting. I have never been in Switzerland, so I look forward to that. And so this is my favorite question. And if you could wave a magic wand and change any one thing, what would it be and why?
Oh my God.
I know.
End suffering.
End suffering.
I think that's
what you would go for straight away.
I mean, end senseless suffering.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting distinction.
Yeah, it is.
Some suffering is meaningful.
Yes, some suffering. Yeah, that's why I had to go back. But yeah, I mean, end senseless suffering would be right up there.
Okay.
That's a powerful magic wand.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, you're the wizard. All right. Well, thank you so much, John. The book, again, American Philosophy, A Love Story by John Kaag. Just an amazing book, and I would really, really recommend you reading it yourself. It goes much more in depth and is a wonderful read. So thanks so much, John, for taking the time.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Read, Learn, Live. If you liked it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. If you hated it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. And so it goes.